Hey, welcome everybody. Great to have you guys here today. I'm so glad that you've carved out time in the busyness of this season to be here today as we reflect upon the real reason behind all the craziness of Christmas time. And let me give a big shout out and a warm welcome to those of you who aren't actually here in the room but are watching this service online. Great to have you guys with us as well. In fact, everybody in the room, let's make the online audience feel welcome, all right? And today we're continuing this teaching series called Christmas Carols. So here at Parker Hill, throughout the month of December, we've been thinking about and talking about some of these songs that we hear at this time of the year. We hear them over and over every year. We become very familiar with them, but I'm not sure that we understand them, usually because we're so busy that we don't have time to listen. So we've selected a few Christmas carols that we're using as a starting point for these messages as we dig in deeper to the lyrics and the meaning behind them. And today I want to talk about what I think is one of the most gut-level honest Christmas carols ever written. It's called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. It was actually written on Christmas Day in 1863 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it was written during a very difficult time in his life and a very difficult time in the life of our nation during the Civil War. And you heard our band sing a modern rendition of it just a minute ago. But let me remind you of the lyrics that he wrote. It begins this way: I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And then in the next few verses, he describes what he's seeing in the world around him and all the pain and all the brokenness. And then this verse, and in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. You see, in 1863, on Christmas Day, Longfellow was feeling the clash between the spirit of Christmas and the reality of the world around him. He was feeling this gap between what he hoped Christmas would be like and what it was really like. And that can happen to any of us, can't it? There can be this gap between what we wanted, what we hoped for, what we thought our lives would be like, and how our lives really turn out, even at Christmas time. In fact, I think one of the best examples of this disconnect between hope and reality is when kids write letters to Santa Claus at Christmas time. I always get a kick out of letters the kids write to Santa Claus. Let me show you a few that represent some pretty high expectations. Like this one from Sarah. Dear Santa, I would like some Taylor Swift tickets. I would also like clothes from Nordstrom and a boyfriend. All right, Santa, get me a boyfriend. That's a pretty tall order for Santa. And by the way, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because if you've ever listened to Taylor Swift, about half her songs are about breaking up with boyfriends. Anyway, I am never, ever, ever getting back together. But Sarah has some pretty high expectations for what Christmas morning is going to bring her. How about this next one? Dear Santa, I flushed my brother's head in the toilet, but can I have a puppy? I don't know, a puppy seems like a lot to ask for when you're flushing your brother's head in the toilet. One more. Santa, I've never even seen a reindeer eye to eye. Please leave Rudolph on my doorstep. Sincerely, Lily. Like, Santa, can you give up your most famous reindeer for me this Christmas, okay? So these are kids who have some really high expectations and hopes and dreams for Christmas, but I have a sense that they're going to be disappointed on Christmas morning. And life can be like that for all of us. We can have hopes and dreams and expectations of how our lives are going to turn out, but then sometimes life does not measure up to our hopes and dreams. Like when the doctor walks in the waiting room and says, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. When your spouse walks in one day and says, it's over, I found somebody else. Or maybe you're a parent like the parent who texted me this morning from our Wilkes-Barre campus between services. Maybe you're a parent who's struggling a bit with one of your kids, and they're taking a path that you never thought they would take, and that's difficult for you, that's disappointing, it's heartbreaking for you. Or maybe there's somebody who's not going to be at the Christmas dinner table this year because you've had to say goodbye to them this year. They've died, you've lost them. Or maybe for you, it's not one disappointment in life, but maybe it's a collection of hopes and dreams that have never become reality for you, and you're just struggling. And when life doesn't measure up to our expectations, we can become discouraged and even disillusioned. Disillusioned with God himself. Like, God, where are you? God, don't you care? God, why is this happening to me? And here's the thing. Oftentimes, those feelings of discouragement are only amplified in the Christmas season, right? Because you're feeling discouraged at a time when it seems like everybody else around you is feeling peace and joy and family togetherness and love. At least that's what you're seeing. And so your feelings of discouragement are only amplified against the backdrop of the joy that's supposed to be a part of this season. So if you've ever felt what St. John of the Cross called that dark night of the soul, let me just give you a truth today that I think will encourage you. One simple statement. I believe that God can do his greatest work in our darkest hours. I really believe that God can do his greatest work in our darkest hours. In fact, I think one of the most powerful examples of that truth is the Christmas story itself. You may not realize this, but when Jesus was born on that first Christmas, he was born into a world that was dark and difficult. He was born at a time when people were struggling with discouragement and fear and oppression. You see, that's the real Christmas story. What I want to do today is I want to read through the Christmas story that's so familiar to us from Luke chapter 2, and then I want to go back and dig a little bit deeper into it so we can see the reality behind what was happening on that first Christmas. Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register, so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, I'm sure you've heard the Christmas story before, and whenever we hear that read, we always have this image in our minds of a very pleasant, peaceful experience, right? The angels are singing, the drummer boy is drumming, the cattle are lowing, whatever that is, and it's this wonderful, beautiful, peaceful experience, but that is not reality. That is not the reality of that first Christmas. I want to look a little bit deeper into the Christmas story. Before we do that, let me remind you just one more time what's happening next weekend. Next Saturday, we begin 14 Christmas services. All 14 are identical in terms of content. So pick one that you want to attend. Better yet, pick one that somebody you're inviting can attend. And show up Saturday at 3 and 5, next Sunday at 2 and 4, or Christmas Eve at 2 and 4. And maybe you're going to attend one with your family and then attend a separate one to be with the people that you've invited, or maybe you can serve one and then attend a different one. However that works for you, make sure you're here, but really try hard to have somebody else come along with you because, as we've said before, this is the time of the year when people are most open to spiritual conversations. So on your way out today, take an invite card, hand it to somebody and just say this: if you don't have a church to attend for Christmas, we'd love to have you join us. Going to be a great weekend. Hope to see you there. Hope to see you there with somebody, okay? All right, so let's jump into Luke chapter 2, and let's talk about the essence of the real Christmas story. All right, so in order to really understand what happened that first Christmas, the first thing we have to understand is what the world was like at that time. And verse 1 gives us a couple of clues as to what was happening in the world. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Now, in order for you to really understand what was happening in the world at that time, I have to give you a little bit of history. So are you guys up for a little history lesson today? Clap your hands if you want some history. All right. I know you don't mean it, but thank you for clapping. So here's some history. So at this time in history, the nation of Israel had been conquered by the Romans, and so the people of Israel had been absorbed into this vast Roman Empire. The Jewish people were this really small group of people living way over on the eastern edge of the vast Roman Empire. At this time in history, they had no independence, no freedom, no dignity. and a huge portion of their income was being taken from them in the form of taxes in order to fund the expansion of the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans did not respond well. They did not tolerate people who pushed back against their authority, especially the Jewish people. In fact, a few years ago, Time magazine had an article about what the world was like at the time when Jesus came into the world. And there's this one sentence in the article. Listen to this. In 4 BC, angry Jews threw stones down on their occupiers from the temple porches and set off a citywide riot. Eventually, 2,000 rebels were crucified along the roads leading to Jerusalem. So you got to understand, this is a very dark, very difficult time for the Jewish people. They were living in this world of oppression and violence under the heavy thumb of the Roman Empire. Now, go back to verse 1. Verse 1 tells us who was leading the Roman Empire at that time. It was Caesar Augustus. He was the one who was the leader of the empire. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Caesar Augustus was actually the adopted son of Julius Caesar. His given name, his actual name was Octavian. He ruled the Roman Empire from 27 BC to 14 AD. And in case you're wondering what kind of a leader he was, the first thing he did when he took power was to kill 2,300 of his political enemies. Okay, you think political leaders today are bad? Nothing compared to a guy like Octavian. But he ruled so effectively and so successfully that he expanded the Roman Empire in terms of wealth, in terms of military strength, in terms of its size. And so eventually he was given this title, Caesar Augustus. And the word Caesar is a title. It means king or ruler. Augustus means great one. So he was the king, the great one. It would be like my wife calling me husband Augustus. It would mean husband, great one. Okay, so you get the point here? Well, by the time Jesus came along, Caesar was not only seen as a great leader, he had come to be seen literally as a god and worshiped as a god. I'll give you an example. This is a Roman coin from the first century. You can see the image of Caesar Augustus imprinted on the coin. You may remember one time when Jesus was asked a question about whether or not the Jewish people should pay their taxes to the Roman government. And here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22. He said, "Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose portrait is this and whose inscription?" Whose portrait and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Here's what Jesus was saying. He was saying, listen, you can go ahead and give Caesar his taxes, but make sure you give your allegiance, make sure you give your worship only to God. Now here's why he said that. Let me go back to the inscription and the portrait on that coin. So on one side of the coin, there's this inscription, Caesar Augustus. On the other side is this Latin phrase, Divi Pater Patriae. Translated, that means divine father of his country. And so here's what you have to understand. Caesar Augustus was literally seen as a god to the people of the Roman Empire. In fact, let me read something from a book entitled Church History in Plain Language. Once a year, every Roman citizen had to come to the temple of Caesar and had to burn a pinch of incense there and say, "Caesar is Lord." When he had done that, he was given a certificate to guarantee that he had done so. Okay, so every Roman citizen, and the Jewish people by and large were not, but every Roman citizen had to say publicly once a year, "Caesar is Lord, Caesar is Lord." And so this phrase, "Caesar is Lord," became very, very commonplace throughout the Roman Empire. Okay, so to really understand the Christmas story, you have to imagine living in a nation of people who are saying, "God, if you're there, and God, if you care about us, why is Caesar claiming to be God and getting away with it? And why are we, your people, being so severely oppressed?" See, Jesus was born into this world, a world in which God's people were being oppressed, and a world in which a Roman king was being worshiped. Okay, so off in a small corner of this vast Roman Empire, there's this young couple living among an oppressed people. Their names are Mary and Joseph. And their lives are already difficult, but their lives are about to get much more difficult. Let me tell you a little bit about Mary and Joseph. The first thing you need to know about them is that they were young. In verse 5, it says there that Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. Now, in that time and in that culture, you were pledged to be married in your teenage years. So Joseph and Mary were probably in the neighborhood of 15 or 16 years old at the best. So they're very young. They're just beginning life together. And their life together is about to get very complicated. Second thing to understand about them is that they were very ordinary. You know, Joseph, as you probably know, grew up in a blue-collar home. His dad was a carpenter. And Joseph and Mary both came from a small town called Nazareth. It was one of those small towns with just, a few hundred people in it, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, Nazareth in that day had kind of a negative reputation. The people were seen as kind of simple or backward. In fact, later on, one of the disciples of Jesus, his name was Philip, he finds a friend of his named Nathanael, and he says to him, "We have found the Messiah. He is Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael says to him, "Nazareth? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" I mean, this is how people from Nazareth were perceived. They were very simple, ordinary people. So the third thing about Mary and Joseph is this: not only were they young and ordinary, they were very poor. It was part of the Jewish law in that day that whenever your firstborn child was born, you would bring an offering to the temple as a way of thanking God for this new life. And typically, people would bring a lamb as an offering. But there was an accommodation made in the Jewish law. For people who were very, very poor and couldn't even afford a lamb, you could bring either 2 doves or 2 pigeons. So this is Mary and Joseph. Like Joseph and Mary took Jesus to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. And here's what that's telling us: that God entrusted his son to a young couple who could barely make ends meet. They were young, they were ordinary, they were poor. Life in some ways was already overwhelming. And at this point, Joseph and Mary were living in Nazareth. She was probably about 8 months pregnant, and I'm sure they had no plans to travel anywhere. Like they were just staying close to home until the baby came. But then the most powerful man in the world, Caesar Augustus, 1,500 miles away in Rome, is, having lunch one day, probably eating a salad, a Caesar salad. And while he's sitting there, a thought pops into his head. You know what? I think I'll issue a decree, and we'll do a census, and we'll have everyone go to the town of their ancestry. And so Joseph and Mary have no choice but to listen to a decree. Verse 1, here's how it happened. In those days, Caesar Augustus, most powerful man in the world, issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And by the way, when the Romans took a census, they did it for 2 reasons. Number 1, they wanted to know how many people were in the empire and who they were, so they could tax every single one of them as much as possible. And they also wanted to know how many able-bodied men they had in the empire so that they could conscript them into the army if they ever had to defend their borders. And so this census begins, and so here's what happens, verse 3. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. Now, decree is issued. Joseph and Mary have to travel to Bethlehem. Do you know how far that was? It wasn't 5 miles. It wasn't 50 miles. It was a 90-mile journey from Bethlehem from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And it was a 90-mile journey through some pretty rugged terrain. Now, I have never been 8 months pregnant, but I'm going to venture a guess here that at that point in your life, you're really not up for a 90-mile journey, maybe on foot, maybe on the back of a donkey. Either way, 90 miles across the wilderness. Nobody wants to do that. But they didn't have much choice because the decree had been issued by the most powerful man in the world, Caesar Augustus. And so they leave and they go to Bethlehem. They get to Bethlehem, and shortly after they're there, the labor pains begin to come, because verse 6 says this. It says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Now just stop right there and think about this. Put yourself in their shoes. Try to imagine how Mary and Joseph must have felt. They were probably saying, God, why now? Why here, where we don't know anybody? Why a census right now when we have to give birth to this baby? I mean, this must have been a very dark time in their lives. I think Mary and Joseph must have felt like the victims of circumstances beyond their control, like pawns in this game that a Roman emperor was playing. I mean, the phrase Caesar is Lord, that must have felt very real to them at this moment because they weren't in control of their lives. But the truth is, Caesar wasn't Lord, was he? In fact, he was just a small player in a much bigger story that God was writing in history, because 700 years before this, a Jewish prophet by the name of Micah had foretold where the Messiah would someday be born. And he wrote this, he said, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." And see, when Caesar Augustus issued that decree, he had no idea he was helping to fulfill a 700-year-old Jewish prophecy. In fact, I'll bet he didn't even know where Bethlehem was. He was just doing what Roman emperors do. He was controlling the world. Or at least that's what he thought. The truth is, he was just a bit player in a much bigger drama. See, God needed to get Joseph and Mary to the right place at that time. And so he just reaches down and he stirs in the heart of the most powerful man in the world so that he issues a decree so a 700-year-old Jewish prophecy could be fulfilled. See, God was doing his greatest work even in their darkest hours. And you kind of know what happens next, right? Mary and Joseph, they arrive there in Bethlehem. Right after they get there, it's time to give birth to the baby. And because this little tiny town of Bethlehem just had this influx of people, there was no room for them anywhere. Even Motel 6 did not leave the light on for them. And so they end up literally in an animal enclosure, in a barn. And it says that she gave birth to a son, wrapped him in cloths, and placed him in a manger. Now, as Americans, we hear the word manger and we think, oh, a manger. It's a nice little wooden box with very clean straw that every mother would want to put her baby in, right? That's a manger, right? No. Number one, it was probably made of stone. Number two, it was covered with animal saliva and bits of food that were left over. It's no place that any mother would ever want to put a baby. But Mary and Joseph, they had no choice. That's what they were left with. And I'm sure at this point in their lives, this was a very dark moment. This is not what they were expecting. This is not what they were hoping for. They were living in this cruel world where they were forced to take a journey that they didn't want to take and then give birth in the worst conditions imaginable. See, that's the real Christmas story. And it must have been overwhelming for them. What a dark time. But here's what was happening. At that very moment, as she has just given birth, an announcement was made to some shepherds who were working the night shift. We talked about this last week. So an angel comes and says, "I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ," what's it say? "The Lord." Christ, the Lord. They're living in this world where almost everybody is saying, Caesar is Lord. And the angel comes and says, yeah, it may feel like Caesar is Lord right now, but he's not. This baby in a feeding trough, he's the true king. He's the Lord. So here's my question when I read this story. Is the Christmas story just a quaint story about two Jewish kids on a donkey having a difficult time? Or is it about something far bigger than that? See, I think the Christmas story is about something far bigger than we really understand sometimes. It's a story about two different kings and two different kingdoms, because in verse 1, Luke mentions Caesar Augustus, and then in verse 7, he mentions a baby in a feeding trough. These are two different kings and two different kingdoms. A kingdom that's built on oppressing people, and a kingdom that will be built on loving people. A king who centers his life around protecting his power, or a king who comes into this world and gives up his power. A kingdom that's meant to use people, or a king that comes to rescue people? I mean, think about this. Suppose you and I are living in the Roman Empire 2019 years ago, and we're standing around having a discussion in our togas. And I pose a question to you, and I say to you, name one person who is destined to change the course of history. Who would you say? What name would you give? Caesar Augustus or Jesus? Yeah, the Roman emperor or the Jewish baby in a feeding trough in a town nobody's ever heard of? Yet 2,000 years later, the Roman Empire is nothing but a pile of rocks, and Caesar Augustus gets one paragraph in a history book. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ remains and grows and thrives in the hearts of men and women all over the world. And when it seems like the Caesars of this world are winning, when you find yourself wondering how long the darkness is going to last, you just remind yourself, the Caesars of this world will not have the last word. Loneliness will not have the last word. Cancer will not have the last word. Divorce will not have the last word. Unemployment will not have the last word. God will have the last word, and He's still at work even in the darkest hours of our lives. I couldn't help but think about Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a leader in the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. The Lutheran Church gets its name from Martin Luther. He was a great leader, a brilliant theologian, but he was a man who was given to depression and discouragement, sometimes deep discouragement. And his wife, Catherine, one time noticed that he had been deeply discouraged for a long time and wasn't coming out of it, and nothing she said seemed to change anything. So one day, do you know what she did? She dressed all in black, and she put on the kind of outfit that you would wear when you were mourning the death of someone. And when Martin Luther saw his wife, he said this, "Why are you dressed like this?" She said, "Because someone has died." He said, "Who?" She said, "Well, it seems that God must have died." And he got the point. See, he knew theologically that God was very much there. He just had to stop acting as if he was dead. Can I be honest with you? Sometimes I act as if God is dead. Sometimes I act as if God is not there, doesn't care, has abandoned me. And I just have to stop and remind myself that even in the darkest times of my life, God is very much alive. In fact, let me go back to this Christmas carol. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. So Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he wrote this verse, "And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth," I said, "for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And then a verse or two later, his perspective changes completely, and he writes this, "Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, and the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men." The theme of that Christmas carol, and really I think the real theme of the Christmas story, is God's sovereignty. And the word sovereignty is a word that we don't use very often. It's kind of a theological word. You may not understand what it means. But the easiest way to understand the word sovereignty is with these 5 letters in the middle of the word, R-E-I-G-N, reign. God's sovereignty refers to the fact that He is the ultimate king, and He ultimately will reign over human history and over the circumstances of our lives. That He still is there and still is in charge. And if we believe that, if we know that, it changes the way that we navigate life, even the very difficult and darkest times of life. You may be familiar with this image. Back during World War II, the British government printed up a lot of posters that were meant to inspire the people of the British Empire during the war, so that they would be able to keep perspective on things. And this particular poster was printed, but it was never distributed. They never ended up using this one, and almost all of them were destroyed after the war was over. But there was a shopkeeper in London who found one of these in an old box, and he framed it, and he put it up on the wall of his shop, and it became so popular, he started printing copies of it, and eventually it ends up on coffee mugs and T-shirts and all kinds of things. It just says, "Keep calm and carry on." But at the top of the poster, there's this crown. It's a replica of the crown of King George, who was the king at the time. And it was intended to be a reminder to the people that their king would do everything within his power to protect them and give them victory in this war. And because they lived under the reign of a good king, they could keep calm and carry on. That's what trusting in God's sovereignty means. That we live our lives and serve the one true King, and we know that He reigns over all the circumstances of our lives and over human history down to the very smallest detail. And if we believe that, then in those dark and difficult times, we can keep calm and carry on. So we're going to end today by thinking about another very dark time in history, another very dark time in the life of Mary. It was about 33 years later, when she stood now not next to a manger, but next to a cross where Jesus, her son, was being crucified. And if we had been in the crowd with her that day, we would have seen a man on that cross who had healed the sick and fed the hungry and loved the outcast. A man who was guilty of no crime, a man who had demonstrated himself to be repeatedly the Son of God. And by the end of that day, his cold, lifeless body was taken from the cross and it was placed in a tomb, and a stone was rolled in front of the tomb, and a seal was placed on the stone by the Roman government, and soldiers were put there to guard it. I mean, it seemed so final, so irreversible, it seemed as if death had won. That was a dark, dark moment. But then Sunday morning came. And the stone was rolled away, the seal was broken, the soldiers were scattered, and Jesus was alive. But see, in the darkness of that Friday, when it seemed as if evil had won, when it seemed as if history was going in completely the wrong direction, that is when God was most at work, when He was loving us the deepest, because He entered into human history in the form of His Son and plunged Himself into a depth of suffering that none of us will ever know, and He did that to set us free from our guilt and shame and to open up a way for us to have life eternal with our Father in heaven. But on Good Friday, that wasn't so obvious. But even though it was unseen, God was deeply at work in that moment. So Christmas reminds us, but the cross also reminds us, I'll say it one more time, that God can do His greatest work in our darkest moments. And so at the end of our time together today, we're going to celebrate communion together. And communion is simply a way for us to remember the cross and to reflect upon God's love for us, not only in Bethlehem, but also on a hill outside Jerusalem. Not only in a manger, but also at a cross. And in just a moment, the ushers are going to come and they'll pass a bucket down your row, and you can reach in and take out a cup. And that little container has in it the two elements of communion. It has the wafer of bread on top representing the body of Christ, and also the juice underneath representing His blood that stained that Roman cross. And take one of those and hold on to it until your campus pastor comes and walk you through communion. But as the ushers come, just watch this with me.